Thank you all for being here. My talk today is going to be on the experience of Detroit, Polonia during the Great War that, now we've come to, with another war behind us, come to call World War I. We're here today, as Lori said, to honor Joseph Frank Bigos, a Polish immigrant who served in World War I, and he was one of the lucky ones who came back. What I'd like to do today is put Mr. Bigos' life into a wider framework of the world he became a part of when he arrived in the United States, as far as I could tell, in 1900 as an infant. The Detroit Polonia, to which he contributed and which no doubt also helped shape him, and the choices he made, including the choice to go to war, the values he held, the life he built, and his service to the United States and to Poland. What you're looking at in this slide is the cornerstone of, sorry about this, but the east side, Dom Polski, which translates to something like that the nation will be proud of us, that the nation is proud of us. And of course, that nation refers to Poland. But the Great War would illustrate that enduring connection to Poland, but also prove a path through which Polonia's place in America was tested and solidified. So while a lot of attention is often focused on World War II in the Polish-American community, a closer look at the Great War illustrates some of the issues that work to shape and divide and unite the emerging American Polonia, issues that are not that different from those that characterize Polonia today. Issues of regional identity, of our relationship to the old country, of social class, of gender, of religion, of politics. These were and continue to be the complex components around which we form and reform our identities as Polish Americans and as human beings in a complex world. Joseph Bigos was probably, like many other Polish immigrants, making a life for himself in Detroit, Polonia. So what was that Polonia like, especially in the years leading up to the outbreak of World War I, of war in Europe in 1914, through America's official entry into the war in April 1917, and through the armistice of 1918 and the reestablishment of a Polish state? We're all aware that when Joseph Bigos' parents brought their son to the U.S., as part of the great migration of European migrants that probably a lot of our families were part of, through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Poland did not exist as a nation, or rather as a state, because nationhood is something, I would say, that resides within our own hearts and minds and souls. But during those 123 years of dismemberment by Prussia, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, the evolving idea and ideal of Poland was debated, it was cultivated, it was expressed individually and collectively in Europe and in the diaspora. Bigos himself was born a citizen of Austria-Hungary. He was born in Miskolc, which is now Hungary, where he was registered as Bigos János, or Bigos József. So he came and took another identity, a Polish identity, in the U.S. So by the time the Bigos family arrived in January 1900, a network of institutions, national and local, already served and was creating Polish America. Those included the fraternal organizations, the Polish National Alliance, the Roman Catholic Union, the Polish Women's Alliance, and of course the Polish Falcons, for whom the Great War would be its finest hour. It included neighborhood parishes, Roman Catholic, but also Polish National Catholic, Baptist, Congregationalist. It included the many social outlets like the sports teams, the political organizations, the professional organizations, local businesses, the theater groups, the bars, the clubs, and the meeting halls. It was a lively place. As I said, it was a lively place which did not always speak with one voice. So, we've got the Polish National Alliance on the right, on the top, on the right politically, and the Polish Socialist Congress, both meeting in Detroit in large numbers. It was a city with a growing and often restive workforce. I know that Your mother, you said, was a cigar worker. Well, here was a cigar strike, happened in 1916. The Packard motor. People came for those, mostly for those industrial jobs. It's estimated before the war cut off immigration, the Polish population of Detroit was around 110,000. So Poles were numerous and visible enough to petition the Board of Education to offer Polish language classes in the elementary schools in the Polish neighborhoods. The city of Detroit didn't go along with that, but there were enough Poles here that it made sense to make that request. And the newspapers reported widely on the size and the liveliness and the vibrancy of the Polish neighborhood. This first art of the newspaper article you'll see there is a little earlier, from 1896, but even then the Detroiters were talking about the human hives of that East Side neighborhood, in which there were over 200 children living on one street alone. Yeah, amazing. So let's look at 1914 in Detroit, Polonia, when Joe was about 15 years old. As the threat of war escalated in Europe, the local Polish Falcons were also escalating their preparation for Poland's defense, with downriver Detroit as their battlefield. So in April of that year, two Falcon armies faced off in war games along the Detroit River at Fort Street. Over 400 invaders challenged 400 Detroit defenders. In the overnight hours. They started at like 2 a.m. I don't know what the neighbors were thinking, like when these guys were doing this, or what the police were thinking. They were all dressed in uniform, and they were carrying what the newspaper called muskets. I don't know what kind of arms they actually had, but it sounds dangerous. And in fact, it resulted in a total of 45 injuries. After the battle, which lasted from about 2 a.m. till dawn and extended all the way down to Wyandotte, Dr. Edmund Konechny, who had come to figure large in local activities touching on the war, gave a lecture entitled appropriately Caring for the Wounded. Local Falcon leader Rudolf Majewski said, "It is the object of these maneuvers to train the Turners," which was the Falcons, in handling arms and getting them acquainted with actual work on the battlefield. We believe that Poland's chance to struggle for her freedom will arrive sooner or later, and we want to be ready. We're all familiar with the slogan, "For your freedom and ours," right? In that same month, the Falcons began recruiting at the West Side headquarters to help their adopted country in an anticipated conflict with Mexico, which was looming at the time in 1914, in keeping with that familiar slogan. I'm not sure whose freedom was threatened there, the United States or Mexico's, but the Falcons were ready to serve if America went to battle with Mexico. With the local Polish language press, while they had a little bit of fun reporting on these war games, it also reported often on the Polish community activities, not just the exploits of Polish Tigers pitcher Jeronim Kowalewski, you see there, or the appearance of nationally known wrestler Zbyszko at the St. Albertus Parish Hall, which are seen here in clippings from the Dziennik Polski. It may also surprise us nowadays to see how visible a part of Detroit life the Polish community became. Meetings of the Polish Press Club, literary soirees, and rallies in support of Polish independence at the East Side Dom Polski were covered in detail, so that non-Poles in Detroit became well aware of the Polish community and its importance and its vibrancy. So through reports like these, English language readers became acquainted with Polish historical milestones like the 1863 Uprising and the 3rd of May Constitution, with Polish writers and artists, and with the activities of their neighbors. For instance, Detroiters also learned of a new nonpartisan educational society being formed on the East Side to educate voters, promote political and social betterment, as they termed it, and create citizenship schools, to end the days when and I quote, when the professional politician would buy up hundreds of Polish votes by treating crowds of voters in saloons to a keg of beer. I'm not sure that stopped. The Polish reputation for hard partying was also reflected in the story of a Detroit police officer who got reprimanded. Actually, he hit his sergeant when they got in a fight because his sergeant found him drinking at a Polish dance instead of being out on patrol. The officer said that, well, they told me that I should go out on patrol and look for trouble. And I guess trouble was where he thought he would find it. It also reported, the papers also reported on a tradition that I don't know if any of you have heard of. I had not heard of it before, that back in the day, Polish families on Thanksgiving used to go and buy a whole hog, a live hog, and march it home down the streets and butcher it for the holidays. I'd never heard of that, but apparently in 1914, it was a big, widely known phenomenon. Anybody ever heard of that? No, new one on me too. And Detroit's Polish Constitution Day parade must have been a sight to behold, as thousands marched downtown from the Domopolski to Woodward, meeting up with the West Side Poles at Grand River, and then proceeding to City Hall and back to the Domopolski for speeches, performances, and military drills. Must have been a long day. So, but lest we have too rosy a picture of Polish patriotism in those days, we're reminded that it could also bump up against, quite literally in this case, the concurrent impulse to Americanize. So here we've got, this very visible march up, the main drag of Detroit, right, to City Hall, thousands of people. But on the other hand, we had folks like John Stefano, or what's his name? Alex Perkowski, who owns this movie theater on Shane Street. He says, no Polish movies for us. But his two young teenage workers say, well, we don't agree with that. And they punched him out. So, the newspapers, like I said, had really fun with these stories. But they also show something about the liveliness of the Polish community at the time, the activities, how visible they were, and also that that it didn't speak with one mind. Public display of unity at events like the Constitution Day parade disguised those conflicts and disputes, and that shouldn't be a surprise to those of us in Polonia today. One of those fissures became publicly visible in a 1914 lawsuit against the publishers of Dziennik Polski, in which the attorney August Sadowski accused the paper of libel for calling him a Hakatist. Does that word ring a bell with anyone? Well, I had to look it up too, which he said calling him a Hakatist, or Hakatist, I guess, cost him the Democratic nomination for state senator back in 1910. So what is it? The details of this whole accusation are kind of murky, especially after 100 years and not knowing the ins and outs of Polish and Polish-American politics. But it seems that Sadowski pandered to German voters by telling them he was a German and a Pole. And once they called him that, the Hakatists were the Prussians who appropriated German territory, or Polish territory in Prussia. So Sadowski ended up winning. He won $15,000 in that libel lawsuit, the highest award for libel in Wayne County at the time. So that accusation of collusion with the Germans held weight. So this incident points to the complications the war in Europe presented for Poles in the U.S., and certainly for the Polish community of Detroit. When war broke out in Europe with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in July 1914, it meant both disaster and opportunity for Poles. Polish villages would become battlefields, while Poles would be conscripted into conflicting armies fighting against each other as citizens of either the allied German and Austro-Hungarian empires or of the Russian Empire. Oh, and you can see how that divides up with Poland split between the two warring sides. At the same time, the war presented the possibility of a Poland reborn from the ashes of the occupying empires. The Dziennik's headline expressed both the horror and the opportunity. Above the mast, it urges Poles to rise up and cast off their shackles. The main headline tells of a conflagration. So it's an opportunity and it's a disaster. And the three columns reflect the situation in each of the partitions: Austria, Russia, and Germany. American Polonia had kept the idea alive since its earliest days of fighting for the Polish cause. But now, while America had declared its neutrality, the question for Polonia became which of the regimes, if victorious, would offer the best possibility for an independent Poland when all was said and done. Not only did this question give rise to furious debate nationwide in the Polish community and abroad, but the American government's misunderstandings of the nuances of these Polish perspectives on the war resulted in the surveillance of and legal action against Poles in the U.S., including those in Detroit. American government couldn't wrap its mind around and its laws around the fact that some Poles were rooting for one side, some for the other, because they saw that side as offering the best possibility for Polish independence after the war ended. So it's easy to imagine how, even before the United States entered the fray, the war was a constant undertone in day-to-day life among the Poles of Detroit. So in 1915, actor Władysław Leszkiewicz entertained audiences with this humorous poem. It was probably a song, but we don't have the music. It's entitled, "It's the Fault of the War," or "It's the War's Fault," Wojna temu winna. And here's a sample, just 3 verses of that poem. I don't know how many of you understand Polish, but I'm not going to read it in Polish, but I'm going to summarize it for you. So in the first verse, the woman goes to the grocery store and she's complaining, "Oh, why are the price of everything's going up?" And he says, and she says, "So what the hell's up with that?" Sus do diabła, z tą drużyną. And the grocer says, "Well, you see, it's because of the war. It's the war's fault." Jan gets married. Couple years pass. No kids, no children. What's up with that? His wife says, "What kind of a husband are you?" And he says, no daughter, no son. Oh, and he hangs his head. It's the war's fault. And here in Detroit, we've got 2 Polish papers. Sometimes they go hand in hand and agree with each other, and they write their polemicals, right? But one is siding with the Germans, one siding with the Russians. Sometimes they're both right. It's all the fault of the war. So, but, despite of the occasional lightheartedness of the local Polish theater, the anxiety about family members in the European theater of war must have been a constant undertone of the family and community life. As communication became more difficult for those separated by both ocean and battlefield, Chicago's Dziennik Narodowy published short messages from and to the Poles in Europe who had trouble communicating in any other way. In November 1915, for example, Jan Zimuła of Węki Dolne used the paper to reach out to Basha Zimuła of St. Albans Street here in Detroit. He says, "Everyone at home is healthy, though they suffered greatly because of the war. The Russians burned a lot of buildings in the village, but their home is standing. They drafted Stash and Jędrusz into the army. It was a very nice harvest." Aniela Mariola of the West Side was told that the house in which she'd lived in Kołączyca was struck by a missile. Families in Detroit were also seeking news of their families in Europe through the paper. Józef Loda of Plumer Street was searching for news of Katarzyna, Franciszka, Maria, and Anna from Nagosian near Dębica in Galicia. Józef Oraszewski of Russell Street was looking for his mother and his wife, who had been living in Radzanowo near Płock in Russian Poland, spanned all the partitions, and everyone was looking to be reassured about the state of their family and their homes. The emotional toll on worried families must have been traumatic, and the story of worry and longing told by these short messages were no doubt shared by thousands of Polish families across Detroit. My own family story kind of intersects with this. My paternal grandmother was born in the U.S., but taken back as a child in 1914, just in time for the war to break out. And then she was, the whole family was stuck in Poland. She didn't come back until the 1920s. And paradoxically, my great-grandmother went back to Poland in 1939. And I don't know, somebody should have been watching her if they wanted to prognosticate about when war would break out, when she ended up in Siberia. While America remained neutral and recruitment into what came to be Haller's Blue Army had not yet begun, the imperative to help Poland was no doubt widespread. It prompted auto worker Peter Uwanowski of Ferry Street to break off his engagement, explaining in a note, quote, "My country has called me to war. I cannot marry you now." His heartbroken 19-year-old fiancée, Frances Świadkowska, tried to take her own life by drinking carbolic acid. That was a common method of suicide back in those days. But eventually she recovered, and Ułatowski, it turned out, did not break up with Frances and return to Poland to fight, but rather he and Frances were married the next year. And I couldn't resist following up on their story. And a couple years later, his U.S. draft registration shows him claiming a family exemption as a husband and father. But concern for Polish suffering, especially the plight of Polish widows and orphans, was widespread within Polonia and among non-Polish Detroiters. Numerous relief organizations collected funds and raised awareness for war victims. The Ladies' Polish Relief Committee was especially active, with regular fundraising events, including concerts and theater performances. These were not restricted to the Polish community, as evidenced by a 1915 concert at the Detroit Armory, which was attended by 1,500 to 2,000 people and followed by dinner at the fashionable Statler Hotel. Non-Polish city leaders were often in attendance. When Stanisław Stefaniak and Anna Górecka, but it wasn't all the bigwigs. When Stanisław Stefaniak and Anna Górecka were married at St. Hyacinth in 1915, with thoughts of their parents still in Poland, they took up a collection for Polish relief at their modest home reception, and they raised $5.10 for the cause. The American Red Cross also worked with the Polish community to raise funds, as in the 1916 Polish Tag Day endorsed by the mayor of Detroit, Mayor Marks, when 2,000 school children made these tags, which were sold across the city in support of Polish war victims. By 1917, 3 years into the war for Poland, a Red Cross parade featuring Belgian and Polish child war refugees, joined by the Falcons, and including a melting pot demonstration at Cadillac Square. We have no description of the day's ceremony, but I would assume that melting pot ceremony was similar to ones that we've heard of before, right, that Henry Ford would do, where the workers would be dressed in their so-called native garb and walk past the symbolic melting pot and come out dressed as Americans and waving American flags. But even patriotic efforts could result in conflict and accusations. When journalists attempted to attend an invitation-only meeting of the Polish meeting of the Polish Merchants and Industrial Society, one of those organizations of which Detroit was full, a meeting on the subject of aid to the widows and orphans of Polish soldiers, they were called traitors, and the police were summoned to kick them out. The meeting then proceeded normally, and members voted to create a new organization, the Komitet Niepodległościowy in Detroit, the Detroit Independence Committee. So all this activity, this kind of a swirl of activity by different organizations with different outlooks. Differing opinions had long been taking shape on how best to work for that independence. As the European theater divided into the Triple Entente, consisting of Great Britain, France, and Russia, opposing the Axis powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary, polls were divided as to which warring party offered the best hope for a reconstituted American Polish state. These conflicting strategies are best illustrated by the contradictory stances taken by the two most influential strands of the debate, one of which looked to Austria-Hungary, which had a history of leniency when it came to Polish autonomy, but was unfortunately allied with Germany, and the other arguing for putting up with the, for the moment, with the historical mistrust of Russia to cultivate a relationship with the Allies. I don't have to tell you which one out, but getting there was rather messy for the Poles in the U.S., including Detroit. The Komitet Obrony Narodowej, or KON, the National Defense Committee in English, was formed in Europe and allied with Joseph Pilsudski. Under the socialist Pilsudski, who had himself been imprisoned by Russia, KON saw Russia as the primary enemy of Polish sovereignty. As you can imagine, this was become more than an inconvenience as the conflict progressed, and especially as America entered the war with Russia as an ally. Pilsudski, however, had formed a Polish legion of soldiers serving as part of the Austro-Hungarian army, with the express purpose of fighting on the Russian front. Pilsudski's strategy was that once Russia was defeated, the Western allies could take out Germany. Kohn sent organizers to the U.S. even before the war broke out, and the organization was very active in Detroit and Hamtramck. In 1914, local Kohn organizer Dr. Konechny argued for throwing Polish support to a Galician army. He said, I was connected to the Russian army for years as army surgeon, and I know from actual experience that no army in the world could be more corrupt, demoralized, and less intelligent than the Russian army. How much has changed in 100 years? I don't know. At the 1916 semi-annual National Convention held at Schiller Hall at Gratiot in St. Aubin and attended by 150 delegates, strategizing on behalf of Poland left no time for entertainment or fancy dinners. It was all business. It claimed to be the only purely political organization established in this country for the task of aiding in the freedom of Poland, and claimed to have collected $60,000 in Detroit since the start of the war 2 years before in support of Polish war victims. Here in Michigan, Kohn's local chapters raised funds, held meetings and rallies, contributed to the general Polish community activities, and drilled young men who wished to join the Polish Legion and fight the Russians. One of those men was a W. Kłos of 1019 Shane Street, who in 1915 sent the following letter offering his services to the Polish Legion. He says, for those of you who can read the Polish, he says, I'm offering my services. I'm not a rifleman, and I'm not a sharpshooter, and I don't have education in this direction, but I'm an auto worker, and I know how to take care of cars. I'm also a pretty good chauffeur, and I can maybe be of help because I have a driver's license. And so, if I can help out our boys, you can count on me. And he even sent a stamped return envelope so they could answer him. Yeah, it's very sweet, very touching. I haven't been able to find out whatever happened to him. So opposing Kohn's socialist leanings and the Polish legions was the Polish National Alliance, the bigwigs, the Polish National Alliance, the Polish Falcons, and famed pianist and international advocate for the Polish cause, Ignacy Paderewski, in support of Roman Dmowski's Wydział Narodowy, or the National Department. Their advocacy would eventually lead to the creation of the much better known Blue Army under the command of General Joseph Haller. But in the meantime, Kohn representatives were accused of, among other things, trying to provoke workers in the industrial Midwest to strike against the factories who were making munitions. They were denounced as traitors to Polish ideals, and they were reported to the United States government as secret agents of Germany. Polish immigrant newspapers, including Detroit's Dziennik Polski, were accused of publishing Austrian propaganda in exchange for payment and in violation of American neutrality. The result was not only lawsuits and threats of violence, but actual internment of some Cone leaders by the U.S. government. One of those was the Cone activist and author, journalist Czesław Łukaszkiewicz, who lived in Detroit and Hamtramck for part of that time. And he spent 6 months in federal custody, after which he came out and he wrote a series of scathing, really funny, anti-clerical and anti-institutional, Polish institutional novels. In the meantime, however, a rather competing recruitment effort was underway, with which many of you are no doubt familiar. The famous, within Polonia at least, Blue Army of Polish immigrant recruits who fought under the leader of General Haller as part of the Army of France. As we've seen, the Polish Falcons, who were a major part of that effort, had been advocating and training for such an army of Polish immigrants for decades. Their cause was bolstered by the very visible advocacy of Paderewski, who became the voice of the Polish cause to America at large and to President Woodrow Wilson and the American government. Beginning in about 1916, Paderewski made several trips to Detroit, holding concerts and other events to raise funds for and awareness of the Polish cause. Like many other Polish and Polish-American women, his wife, Helena, was also an activist on Poland's behalf, though she complained in January 1916 that her sale of folk dolls for Poland's relief was not very successful here. And she says, "Oh, well, it is too bad. Detroit has not cared for 40 beautiful dolls as have the people of other cities. At Ann Arbor, those splendid university people bought more than half in an hour, more in half an hour than's been bought here all day. Even Omaha have purchased relatively more. But I must not complain. I'm very thankful to all who have purchased, and I cannot pause for vain regrets." Paderewski's efforts paid off when in 1917, Poles who wished to join the Polish cause against the German and Austro-Hungarian armies were, through a convoluted series of negotiations and compromises, were allowed to form their own division of the French forces. So recruiting offices sprang up in Polonian communities across the U.S., including, of course, Detroit, where 2,825 men were enlisted out of the approximately 20,000 total recruits. They were trained at Niagara on the Lake, Ontario, and the history of that heroic service is probably well known to most of you, although it's not well known outside Polish America. And just last year, we know the commemoration was held when those monuments to the Polish soldiers, the Blue Army soldiers, veterans, was created. Even as the U.S. maintained its neutrality, many suspected that it would eventually enter the war. And in early 1917, Dr. Slominski of Shane Street offered to raise an entire regiment of Marines in 1 week. Slominski had served as a surgeon in the Spanish-American War, and he offered his office and home as a recruiting center. His offer was turned down, it was said, because his recruits wouldn't know the English language. At any rate, when the U.S. declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, the door was open to the Polish community to serve in the United States Army. So now they had three choices. This was complicated, however, by restrictions on so-called alien enemies, meaning immigrants who were still legally citizens of Axis countries. In response to this obstacle, a wave of naturalization filings by Polish immigrants resulted. Within 4 days of the U.S. entrance into the war, 300 immigrants were lined up at Detroit's Federal Building in order to file their first papers. The Detroit Evening Times reported in May that, quote, "The Polish people of Hamtramck are showing themselves to be patriotic, with 450 men enlisting in the course of 1 week and holding a parade to the recruiting office at Joseph Campo in Holbrook." The Times also reported on the general preponderance of foreign names among the early recruits. There are very few, if any, of French, a small proportion of Scotch and Irish, and very few real American Anglo-Saxon names. Training occurred at Camp Custer near Battle Creek, where in November, among the 43 languages spoken by the recruits, Polish, spoken by 1,961 men, was second only to German. Despite their eagerness to join the U.S. Army, many Poles from the German and Austrian partitions were designated enemy aliens, and they were discharged as unfit to serve. While America's entry into the war no doubt slowed recruitment into the Blue Army, which did not accept any man who was eligible for the U.S. draft, the efforts did continue, and Prince Stanisław Poniatowski, a lieutenant in the French army, arrived in Detroit with a delegation to encourage enlistment. It was reported that 20,000 Poles paraded, then rallied at Parian Park. They passed resolutions thanking President Wilson for his support of the Polish cause, and Detroit Mayor Marks was among the speakers. In another citywide recruitment effort, a band of Polish musicians from Niagara-on-the-Lake led a march down Woodward Avenue from Grand Circus Park to City Hall. Polish-American Alderman John Kronk was among the organizers of local Blue Army recruiting efforts, and he also served on the Detroit Draft Board for American recruits. As late as October 1918, the Detroit Free Press reported that just within the last several months, more than 200 men had enlisted and were headed to Niagara-on-the-Lake, enlisted in the Blue Army. Other estimates claimed that 100 men a week were being recruited from Detroit. So recruitment was going on on all sides. But it wasn't just the Polish men of Detroit who had a role to play in the European War. We've seen the activism of women's groups like the Polish Ladies Relief Fund, and despite Madame Paderewska's occasional disappointment with her Detroit fundraising, she did recruit young Detroit women into her Grey Samaritans, modeled on the American Red Cross, and organized in cooperation with the YWCA. At least 100 Detroit women received initial training in invalid cooking, home nursing, and first aid, followed by advanced training in New York, paid for by the YWCA. By 1919, Genevieve Wińskiewicz was an advisor to the mayor of Kalisz, Poland. Frances Sobczynska was in charge of a 100-bed children's hospital in Warsaw, and 2 other Detroiters were doing casework among the families of soldiers in Poland. Like the Blue Army, the Grey Samaritans remained in Poland for some time after the armistice of November 11, 1918, continuing their relief work among the children, refugee families, and women soldiers. When American-born Karolina Sławinska of St. Albans Street returned to Detroit in July 1920, she told a tale of profound suffering in Warsaw, where thousands had died of cold and hunger as parents starved themselves so their children could eat. The situation, while desperate, was not as dire as Madame Ino Malberg, who had asserted on a 1917 visit to Poland that it is a known fact that today in Poland there is not a child under 7 years. They have all died. Well, it wasn't quite that bad. For some Grey Samaritans, their training and meaningful work it allowed them to do carried over when they returned. After 3 years in Poland, on her return in 1922, Mary Andrzejewski worked in the Traveler's Aid Department of the YWCA. Frances Sobczynska, we've already heard of. She returned in 1923 from 5 years in Poland with the Samaritans, and she continued social service work with the Polish Activities League at the newly opened St. Elizabeth's House on Parnov Street. Not everyone was so pleased with the opportunities for activism that the war effort opened for women, though. In 1918, Detroit doctor Felix Przybylowski filed for divorce on the grounds that his wife, quote, is a negligent housewife, had declared her aims in life were higher than the domestic plane, and that now she is doing relief work in New York and refuses to come home. His divorce was granted. But for the majority of women who remained at Detroit during the war years, there were other ways to help. We're all familiar with the World War II images of Rosie the Riveter as women stepped into factory work to fill the shoes of the men serving overseas, when auto manufacturing pivoted toward the production of munitions in support of the war effort. Less seldom told is the similar story which took place during World War I, in which Detroit and the women of Detroit, Polonia, played a vital part. A convention of Detroit's Elks held at one of 1,000 Polish and Polish-American representatives in 1918, representing Dmowski's Wydział Narodowy, National Department, the Polish Army in France, and American Polonia's most influential organizations and institutions, demonstrated the importance of Detroit to the national discussion of Poland and Polonia's future and the intersection of the two. It also underscored the fact that the scales of American and Polonian opinion had been tipped from Kohn's left-leaning focus on the Polish Legion and its goal of first defeating Russia. Paderewski certainly caught a romantic figure, and he made the case that Poles are paying for the American citizenship promised them if they enlist with their blood. Quote, There is not one casualty list that does not contain some humble names of Polish soldiers fallen on the glorious battlefield of France. The average number of the Polish boys killed in the defense of the Stars and Stripes exceeds 12%, and as there are not quite 4% of Polish people among the population of the United States, this fact seems to indicate that the Poles in this war are doing more than 3 times their duty. They are not 100%, but 300% American. At the same time, he argued that the right of Poles who were not willing to renounce their European citizenship to fight in their own Polish army under France, and took a swipe at Kohn and the Polish Legion, blaming Germany for any appearance of division within Polonia. There are no factions among the Poles in America. There is one enormous solid block of 4 million people, all true American, and on the other side, there is a small group of embittered leaders out of employment. As the war progressed, however, not only did those lists of recruits contain a disproportionate number of American enlistees, but a growing number of Polish casualties. An admittedly incomplete May 1919 list of Wayne County war dead included almost 140 Polish names, most from Detroit and Hamtramck. They include Private Chester Satkowski, a restaurant employee who was killed in action in France on August 1st, 1918. Frank Bauer, 26, of Engel Avenue, became the first Polish officer of the Blue Army to be killed in action on July 26, 1918, leaving a brother in Detroit and parents in Poland. Despite Paderewski's claims of Polish unity, 1918 was also a year of stepped-up prosecution of Detroit Poles who were alleged to be enemies of the Allied cause and thus of the United States. In August, Russian Poles Anthony Stopa and Albert Firon, who had been an officer in the Austrian army, were each fined $10,000 and sentenced to 10 years in Leavenworth for, quote, making seditious remarks. In 1919, Haller's army chaplain, Father Stanislaw Iczek, penned an editorial in response to reports of anti-Semitic pogroms in Poland, in which he accused Polish Jews of being traitors. The response from the Polish Jewish Committee was swift and relentless and threatened the positive public impressions among Detroiters of the Polish people and the reconstituted Polish nation. And that's a story in itself. When the Great War officially ended on November 11, 1918, it meant a reborn Poland, but not an end to the fighting on its soil. For several more years, the soldiers of Haller's Blue Army remained to fight the Bolsheviks, and the Grey Samaritans remained to provide relief to the victims of war and to help rebuild the social relief infrastructure. And the fact that there was now a Poland to return to and to help shape created an internal crisis of conscience and of identity for many Poles in the diaspora. That is the story for another day. But just as World War I changed the shape of the world as we know it, with far-reaching and unforeseeable consequences on an international stage, the World War also transformed the lives of American Poles in Detroit and elsewhere as they made the personal and familial decisions necessitated by a changing local and international landscape and demanded by the crucible of war. But even as we look at these big overarching issues, let's also be mindful of the individuals who lived through them, like Joseph Bigos, or those who did not. In February 1918, Józef Ciszek left his job as a core maker at Sherwood Brass. He left his parents, Jakub and Anna, and his 5 siblings to enlist in the United States Army. He was joined in June by his older brother, Frank Ciszek. Frank was killed in action in France 4 months later, in October. Joseph met the same fate a month after that. Their grave markers are all the more poignant in that simplicity. And so I leave you with this, they're not my relatives. This final image is a reminder that even as we talk about those big issues of nationhood, of alliances, of flags on a battlefield, of the social and the economic and the political forces through which We recreate the world in which we live, even while we're being created by it. That collective we, that collective Polonia, is made up of real people, real families, real sacrifices, real triumphs, and sometimes real tragedies. Thank you.